Craig Kahlke from Cornell Cooperative Extension's Lake Ontario Fruit Team. This is a virtual Western New York rescue thinning timing meeting. The agenda is on the screen there. Quick intros for my, I'm just going to jump into phenology and kind of thinning and what I saw today and a little bit of yesterday, mainly in Niagara County. Mario is going to talk about what he's been seeing and thinning results. The same with Jim E. from E Farm Service, Vaughn Gingerich from Lake Ontario Ag Consulting, and then Terence Robinson from Cornell. I was definitely out and about this morning. I visited about 29 blocks in Niagara County, and I visited one in Orleans County yesterday. If I averaged the king diameter from all 30 of those blocks across, I took between 10 and 15 measurements from each block, about 18.5 millimeter diameter. So the range of those kings, depending on the variety, was a low of 13.6 and a high of 24.8. The smallest fruit I could find was about 7.2 on some larger fruit.
Okay.
Larger varieties. Inland as high as 21.5, and as far as maximum size, anywhere between 16 and 27. So I looked at about 7 Gala blocks, 5 Honeycrisp blocks, 4 New York 1s, 4 Empires, 2 New York 2, 2 Minnesota 1914, and then 1 each of Fuji, Red Delicious, Mac, Ida Red Rome, and Regal 1045, also known as Wild Twist. I was surprised. There was a lot of blocks there, I would say a little bit more than half of those blocks that I looked at that had a lot of clusters that were 3s that had fruit around the same size. I'm not sure if it was the king and 2 laterals or if the king was gone and if it was just 3 laterals in competing size. So I would think those clusters would need to be broken up, and maybe that a late thinning could work out for some. There were some varieties that were too big already. Those competing fruit were well over 20 millimeters, so I don't think anything could really help at this point. But for the most part, most of the varieties I looked at were in the range if growers needed to do a final thinning this week, sooner rather than later. I guess around the rain. It's raining right now where I am. That could totally work. Natural thinning, I did see some natural thinning. I saw some places too where you would have the king would be way larger than the laterals, and if the laterals weren't falling off, they were falling off when you were putting your hand in the cluster to measure the diameter. So for what it's worth, I'm not positive on how much natural thinning we got. Certainly we got a lot of natural thinning, maybe some over thinning in some blocks that we looked at. But I would say I was pleasantly surprised that there weren't a whole lot of fruit on the ground. That's for sure. With that, I will turn it over to Mario and let him share his observations.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I want to apologize. I was able to summarize my data and I sent that internally to Terence. I don't know if he's going to be able to use it, but I couldn't put it in a PowerPoint slide. I see. So I decided to go this morning first to Geneva to Cornell Agritech, and I checked the cultivars in the block Hansen 20, where it's 14, 13, 15 different cultivars for me to be able to see the separation between inland and lake sites. I saw that separation with almost all the cultivars. The cultivar where was the largest 2 fruitlet, where was the king or no king, or the first lateral. I saw that difference from Geneva up to inland side up to the lake site. So a Miniesca or a Tango was 24 to 25. Aguila in Geneva was close to 20, 19 to 20. But I was able to see that inland side a little smaller in Aguila, 19 to 20, or even in inland and lake sites from 16 to 17 or 16 to 18 millimeters. So at Jonagol, the largest was at 26, around 24. and Mutsu was already 25 to 26 millimeters. And New York 1 in Geneva was still thinning. I was able to see what was happening in the cluster, and that New York 1 site was around 18 to 19. In Geneva versus a 16 to 18 range in inland side, and still they were still thinning. A New York 1 in an inland side was completely over thin, and was around 17 to 19 millimeters already. So, like I mentioned, I went to the largest fruitlets in the cluster. I wasn't measuring really the thing that was obvious to me that are gonna shell, that are gonna drop. I didn't see fruit on the ground. I didn't see the shelling or the natural drop or anything as a result of the heat that we got last Tuesday and Wednesday. I didn't see that situation, but was very obvious to me to see the separation today versus what I saw last week. I saw another ROM. This is another tailored ROM that I learned last week that was with a very low fruit set. I went to see premieres this time, and premiere in inland side were around 22 to 23 millimeters in premiere. A New York 2 was around 20 to 21. A Fuji was around 17 to 18 millimeters. A Pink Lady was around 17 to 19 in inland side. Gala, Honeycrisp and Fuji. Gala and Honeycrisp in a inland, in a lake side, closer to the lake or closer to 104 was already around 16 to 18. Fuji was a little smaller, 17 to 18. Most of the fruit was above 16 millimeters, what I was measuring today. The other thing I would like to share is the soil moisture. So this morning, the soil moisture, especially in Geneva, was way less of what I start seeing in Wayne County, inland side and lake side. So the amount of precipitation was way more, perhaps during the weekend. I didn't check the weather station. I should have reviewed the precipitation, but was very obvious to see more precipitation passing Newark up north. You can see more water. I saw gelas in the lake that still they were thinning. Still you can see there the separation. I talked with a couple growers. Perhaps we were thinking that the thinning was a little bit needed at the top, especially because we had all this soil moisture, all this temperature. The grower was saying that perhaps last precipitation is gonna be tomorrow, Wednesday, but Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday should be dry. Some growers thinking that perhaps they could spray Wednesday, tomorrow, or Thursday, or Friday. So I saw the separation between Geneva inland side and lake sides, but everything was already at the 16 millimeters of the fruitlet that were growing in that cluster by today. That's it.
Thank you, Mario. Just a reminder that folks can put any questions for any of us or comments in the chat box. And then at the end, after Terence's presentation, we should have some time for more questions, and folks can unmute themselves and ask questions that way too as well. With next, I'll turn it over to Jim Eve, crop consultant in Wayne County, and what he's been seeing in the orchards that he works in. The floor is yours, Jim.
Thank you, Craig. Sunday was the last opportunity I had to measure fruit sizes in the study that I do. Actually, at the moment, I'm in the Champlain Valley, and I'm on my way up there all day with a couple of stops on the way. So I would have to interpolate that with the data that I did have, galas at the lake were averaging about 14 millimeters. Galas at Lyons about 19. Max, Ruby Max at the lake were 14. Linda Max at Lyons were 20.4. We can probably add at least one, if not 2 millimeters, 1.5 anyway to those diameters as what I would expect to find today. I compared that data to what I had exactly a week ago, and there was about 6 millimeter change in fruit size in the galas at the lake and at the ridge and Lyons, which is wild inland. For those of you not familiar with that topography, there was about a 10 millimeter increase in 7 days. Very similarly with the max that were inland. The 19th, they were just under 10. In this past Sunday, they were just over 20. I'm seeing a lot of separation. I looked at some Honeycrisp. What day is it? Yesterday, and they were. I'm sorry, on Monday, and there was a bit of size difference. They were thin the second time on. I want to say it was a week ago today, and they were showing the responses. Some of the smaller fruit, it was not clear yet if it was coming off. My notion is half of it will, the other half of it won't. But there's a pretty good dominant fruit population there that's growing well and is quite a bit bigger. So I think they're going to be pretty close. They might be a hair over thin, but it won't be much. By chance, I was in some Honeycrisp today, and Valatia, which obviously doesn't help us with New York, with Western New York, but they're a couple days ahead of us, and their petal fall spray plus their pink spray, bloom spray plus their petal fall spray gave them just an extraordinary thinning job, the best I've seen there. So with that, transposing that and that response to what I think we're seeing in Wayne County, I think it looks pretty good. Most folks got on a bloom and a petal fall or a petal fall, and a few days later, there's a couple blocks that haven't had anything done yet. I don't know what we're going to do there for sure because the weather is turning awful. Those of you who haven't looked at it, it might make 60 tomorrow in Wayne County. The next day is going to be a little better, but still in the 60s. So unless somebody has a question, I'll leave it at that.
You, Jim. And turn it over now to Vaughn Gingerich of Lake Ontario Ag Consulting and what he's been seeing in his clients' orchards.
Thanks, Craig. So thinners that were applied the week before last and previous or prior to that seem to be working pretty good. We see a lot of size separation out there in a lot of those blocks. And in some cases, some fruit is actually beginning to shell off or is very close to. So yeah, in general, that thinning looks really good. In a few cases, maybe a little bit of over thinning, but for the most part, not too bad. I was in one farm today that had galas that were thinned with pretty good rate of carbaryl and Maxell a week ago yesterday, so just before the heat. And those galas are severely over thinned. There's not going to be much left on that farm in those galas, but that's not typical to other places that I saw were thinned in that same time range. So I'm not sure what the difference was there per se. A lot of thinners were put out like Thursday, Friday, Saturday here of this past week. Unfortunately, those results can't be seen yet, or maybe we're just starting to see a little bit of size separation on some stuff done Thursday. But stuff is sizing very quickly. And as Jim alluded to, we don't have very good weather here for thinning over the next few days. So there are some growers that probably have a quandary here, some decisions to make as to whether or not we're going to push the boundaries and think we need to get back out on some stuff before we run out of a window. But yeah, other than that, Most thinning at this point has looked pretty good. And we'll have to make some late decisions.
Thank you, Vaughn. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Terence Robinson from Cornell.
Well, if I can see where my presentation is, I'll show it. Okay, good afternoon.
All good.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like I should say we've got good news and bad news because in many cases, I feel like we've done the job already. But in other cases where we haven't, there's almost no window left and terrible conditions. So each year it's a challenge when growers, especially when there's a frost, have to decide, do I wait and see what I've got and then try to thin? Or do I go ahead at bloom and petal fall and then hopefully I have a set? Well, the ones who've gone ahead at bloom and petal fall and then last week 10 millimeters, I think either have got the job done and there's no need for this meeting, or they in some cases have over thinned. And I'll get to that in a minute. But others who have deferred the decision until now, I think are facing a tremendously difficult problem because we're so rapidly leaving the window for any thinning response, and there's just no good weather to get a response. So I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's a challenge. I felt like that we didn't even need to have this meeting because of the heat. But as I've listened to both Craig and Mario and Jim and Vaughn, there are a number of places where we do need more thinning. I think they're relatively few. But where we do need more thinning, we are right now in the window. And the typical window is when we're between 16 and 20 millimeters. And in some cases, with some varieties, we're already past the 20 millimeters. We still are sort of in the window. And so maybe it is a good thing to have this meeting. Now, the frost damage was widespread, but variable depending on site. I was pleasantly surprised at the relatively good fruit set, even where we had damage. The beautiful thing was that the petal fall spray was applied under relatively warm conditions with a significant carbohydrate deficit. That wasn't the intense heat of last week, it was the previous week. And that resulted in just really good thinning, mostly what I have seen. Then last week we had the meeting on the 10 to 13 millimeter spray on Wednesday, right at the end of this heat spell. It had extreme carbohydrate deficits, and likely there will be a number of blocks that end up over thinned if those thinners went on during that heat. Now, Craig had written me a note, and I want to emphasize here his point, and I mentioned it last week, but not clear enough. Orleans and Niagara County had a lesser deficit than did Wayne County. And so often my concerns about overthinning are related specifically to Wayne County, where people sprayed Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday of last week in the middle of the heat. Those who waited to Thursday, Friday, Saturday likely will not see overthinning because the temperatures were different and the deficits were different. And we probably will end up with just normal type thinning from those. Those people in Orleans County or Niagara County who sprayed Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday were not in this extreme caution, worrisome deficit. They did have a serious deficit, but the kind of deficit that gives you just really great thinning. Looking back, I wish we had had the meeting last week on Monday. I would have been more cautious and told people to wait till near the end of the heat to spray. And that was a mistake, trying to schedule that meeting sort of after or almost at the end of the heat period. So that leads us to the situation where there's just a huge differences in blocks where people sprayed early, those who didn't spray. And so right now we have this situation where there's some overthinning, some really good thinning, and some people haven't thinned. Now, I want to show this data because we do at Geneva trials to try to understand what would happen. So we sprayed in the heat certain treatments. And here's the data on the fruit growth rate model from Honeycrisp and Gala. Now on the Honeycrisp, which is the top chart, you see no blue bar, meaning that we wanted 90 fruits per tree. And at the first measurements, we were already underneath that. But the drastic thing is, in these particular treatments, going from the thinning we got from the petal fall treatment, which gave us 88 fruits per tree, the natural thinning caused by the heat dropped us to 19 fruits, what we measured today, way over thinned, where we wanted 90 fruits. So Honeycrisp responded, at least in this treatment on this particular Honeycrisp block, tremendously to thinners that were applied in the heat, both the petal fall and the 10, 12 millimeter spray. Now below you see Gala. So Gala from the petal fall spray, the first blue bar, it dropped from 1,028 fruits per tree down to 308, but we only want 160. So we basically had twice as many fruits as we want. We went ahead and sprayed in the heat, and that dropped us to 206 this morning. So we're very close to the target. That spray was absolutely vital last week on Gala to get its number down. Now, the problem that Vaughn just mentioned of a Gala block that essentially was totally over-thinned, almost defruited, is surprising. I wonder if it's from a young block, but we could talk about that specific case later. But young blocks will often over-thin with high rates of Maxellin 7. But I wanted to present these two different results from spraying in the heat. Now, I also want to present results from Bobby Brown's in Orchard-Dale up in Orleans County. We're measuring on Honeycrisp, a certain block there. And there's, I think, some really interesting results here of what happened from the heat. So the trees had potentially 700 fruits on the tree, the upper horizontal light blue bar. The target was 70 fruits.
What?
When we measured fruits at the end of the petal fall spray on the 22nd of May, the model estimated that we still had 174 fruits growing, or basically 100 more than we wanted. Now, without essentially any more spray, over the next few days, the trees, the fruit that were still growing dropped to 104 from the natural thinning caused by the heat. And then this morning, we measured again, and there's only 63 fruits left on those trees, or a slight over-thinning. Now, Bobby's mentioned in an email to me, well, he really, that's a little high, he really wants more like 50, so he's probably, that's just perfect. But my point is that with essentially no more thinning, after those petal fall sprays, the heat brought it right down to 63 fruits. And that was in Orleans County. So what happens in blocks that were already close to the target, that were thinned in the heat, is probably over thinning. I feel bad about that. The heat was really a unique sort of challenge. Now, I wanted to point out some of what Craig and Mario have reported in their driving around both Niagara and Wayne County. I summarized Craig's data in this slide, grouped by variety. So there's all the Gala blocks that he visited. And I've highlighted in yellow the ones that he estimated don't need any more thinning. Now, this was done today. And he also estimated if the fruit size is over 20 millimeters, meaning that we're already out of the window. So the first block of Gala, the fruits are big. And so it's pretty much too big to thin, although he feels like they could use more thinning. Only one block out of all the Galas he thought needed no more thinning, meaning that Galas almost always really difficult to thin, and we end up with too many fruits, and they needed that thinning during the heat. When you look at the Honeycrisp block there's 3 out of the 5 that don't need any more thinning and maybe are over thin. And so Honeycrisp responded to the heat and thinners in a much more dramatic way than did Gala. Then you look down at the other varieties, Empire, 2 of the 3 or 4 don't need any more thinning. You look down, New York 2, only 2 blocks, but neither one need more thinning. And this is, I think, the theme that across our industry, they're all over the board. And as Jim said, some blocks have not been thinned at all. And it's just really a big problem, and how you solve that at this point in time. I want now to just comment briefly on Mario's data from Wayne County. It's a slightly different format, but in the inland sites, you can see the fruit sizes for all of the different varieties. And many of them, like the premiers, are over 22 millimeters. And the New York 2s are over 20 millimeters. And so we're outside the window of thinning for those. When we get to the lake sites, then we're still in the window, many 16 to 18s. And so regardless of variety, there's still a moment in time on the more lake sites that we can thin. Even some of the inland sites are still in the 16 to 20 range. So with that sort of comment on the situation and the fruit sizes, let me now shift to talk about the model, the carbohydrate model, and what it all means. So on the top, I've put only one chart in here. That's the Cherry Lawn weather station near Sodas. And it shows that basically, as we came into the petal fall window 2 weeks ago, we were entering this very serious carbohydrate deficit where the 6-day average got down to minus 70. Those are the cases where I say, wow, don't thin. As we move forward into last week, even though we had heat, the deficits were a little bit milder as we entered the 10 millimeter window. And if you sprayed early in that window last week, Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, you got really good deficits. But if you sprayed late in that window, Friday or Saturday of last week, you got almost no deficit. And I want to point that out here in the bottom table. And I want you to look at the types of daily deficits we had starting on May 19th, a daily deficit of minus 40, but it was then going to be followed by 5 days of serious deficit. So the 6-day average is about minus 70. The model paints that red, high risk of overthinning. And if you do thin, decrease chemical rate by substantially. And so when you look at then the individual day deficits, you had a minus 50, a minus 100, 2 days in a row. Now, from shading studies that we've done, if we put that kind of deficit on a tree artificially by shading it, we always drop fruits with no thinner. They just drop because of the shade. That's why I said that Wayne County experienced a natural induced thinning event independent of all the different chemical treatments that people have put on. Now, the 6-day average went from a minus 68 on the 19th, and then it started to decline daily as we got future days that weren't quite so bad. But if you still sprayed on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of last week, you had average deficits in the high minus 50s. And that's why I think there will be, and we will end up with a number of blocks that are over thinned. I want to repeat, I don't think the situation, or it was not based on the model, as severe in Orleans and Niagara County. So if you sprayed over there Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, I don't expect you to see a tremendous amount of overthinning, but it could have happened on some blocks because you didn't have a minus 100 day deficit, but you had a minus 50 day deficit, 2 days in a row of minus 50. Now, that is all hindsight. As we look forward to what we're facing, we've had these days now of cooler and less deficit. And in fact, we've shifted now to a surplus. So if you look at the top chart, the last 2 days are yesterday, today, and tomorrow, last 3 dots. And they have showed deficit or surpluses of carbohydrate of plus 35, plus 40. That's a lot of extra carbon. It's almost impossible to have that much extra carbohydrate in the tree and have a thinner create some sort of a stress to cause fruits to fall off. So this is the bad news of the situation. And I don't see it really improving all that much. Now, the carbohydrate model only predicts forward 5 days. So right now it can predict really up through Saturday. What happens next Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, maybe we'll get a moderation of these surpluses and could end up with a little bit of better thinning. But by that time, the fruits are going to be huge and will be pretty much out of the window of getting any thinning response. So based upon degree days, the best timing for Western New York, whether inland or lake, starts tomorrow, May 29th, and goes through Saturday, June 1st. Now, my suggestion is don't wait a few more days to see what happens, because I don't think the weather's going to help you that much by waiting, but we're rapidly progressing beyond 20 millimeters when we don't get much response. Now, there's relatively cool temperatures today and tomorrow in the high 60s, but then slightly in a warming trend as we get more towards the weekend. And so that might be a strategy you might consider, waiting till Thursday to spray. But even then, you'll have a plus 30 gram carbohydrate balance. And this is always going to give mild thinning when we're at this fruit size. So it's a situation that we know what the problem is, but we don't have a perfect fix for it if you really need more thinning. Now, some suggestions. We know that once fruits get to be 18 millimeters, all thinners have reduced efficacy. Unfortunately, the carbohydrate model indicates there won't be any deficit to help us in the next few days achieve more thinning. But if you do thin, which some of you need to, but I want to restate, I think many, many, many blocks are done. They don't need any more thinner. Well, let me elaborate on that in just a minute. In Craig and Mario's visits and Jim Eve and Vaughn Gingerich, when you see big separation in size, the fruits that are big are continuing to grow, but those that are small, they slowed way down, and many of those will eventually drop. It might not look like it right now, but if their growth rate is so slow that they can't keep growing fast, they will stop growing and fall off. So that's a good sign that there's still thinning going on out there, even though you can't flick them off with your finger yet. So I got sidetracked in what I was saying just to make that point, that I think there's still a lot of thinning going on out there. But if you do need more thinning, I think there are probably relatively few blocks that need more thinning. Nozzle the sprayer, so 100% of that spray goes to the top. Just turn off completely the bottom nozzles. Recalculate how many gallons you put per acre, and then calculate the proper concentration factor. Now, for those who need thinning, there are really, in my mind, only two good options. We've tested all of those options, 7 in oil, NA and 7 in oil, but fruits rapidly lose sensitivity to NA after 16 millimeters. And if we already, based on those sizes that Craig was showing, we've already got, and Mario, we've already got a lot of things close to 20. And so I don't think NA's got any role for us at this stage. We've tested Maxell and NA in oil, but until Exceed came along, our best option was this Maxell 7 in oil. That's the one combination that routinely and consistently gave us some thinning when fruit sizes were big. But now in the last 2 years, we've had an additional option of Exceed with Maxell. Now, I don't know if we've got any Valent people on the call, but although their label and they talk about Exceed by itself as a thinner, I find it a mild thinner, and it needs to be combined with Maxell to get effective thinning. But it is a fabulous addition to our toolbox. So in the cases where you have a Gala block that is still heavy, my suggestion would be full rate of Maxell, which is 64 ounces on a true volume dilute basis, and full rate of Exceed, 400 parts per million. Now for Honeycrisp, we'd like normally to put NAA on, but it doesn't work at this fruit sizes. They're big. And so the only option, which does work, is a slightly lower dose of Maxell of 48 ounces with a slightly lower dose of Exceed at 300 parts per million. Fuji, a full dose of Maxell and a full dose of Exceed if it's heavy. And other things like golden that are hard to thin, you'd want to use a full dose of Maxell and Exceed. So that's a general suggestions for you to consider. I think that this edition of Exceed is fabulous. It works best at the optimum temperatures of around high 70s, 80 degrees, but it'll work fairly well even at these cooler temperatures in the high 60s and low 70s. But remember, you have to calculate the rate correctly using tree rule volume to make the proper amount in the tank. So let's use the example of the full dose of Maxell. I went over this last meeting. We just quickly go over it again. Let's suppose that you are spraying 100 gallons the acre, but your trees are really 200-gallon trees. That's a concentration factor of 2. Many high-density blocks that are younger don't measure 200 gallons. They measure closer to 150. And you're still spraying 100 gallons, then your concentration factor is 1.5. So that means that you would take the 64-ounce rate that I suggested, multiply it by 2, that's 128 ounces or a full gallon to the acre. If you're spraying with a 500-gallon sprayer at 100 gallons, that's 5 acres in a spray tank. That means 5 gallons of Maxell in that spray tank. Now, if you put oil, let me go back. I said another option that's consistently worked for us before we had Exceed was Maxell 7 and oil. It works better than any other combination we've tried. If you choose to put oil in the tank because we have a terrible carbohydrate balance and you need the maximum uptake of chemical, don't use a concentration factor for the oil. So I would suggest a couple of rules of thumb. As you look at your crop and you count the number of big fruit, now I want to reemphasize, fruits that are way smaller, they're probably not growing fast enough to stay on the tree and will likely fall off in about 2 weeks. But if you count the tree and the number of big fruits is 2 times more than your final target, I think you should spray again. But if the crop load is less than 2 times your final target, suppose your final target is 100 fruits and you're at 150, I wouldn't spray again. I would just try to manage that with natural drop that we're going to get more of because of the heat we had and hand thinning. You have a narrow window that's closing rapidly by the end of the week. You have to calculate the proper amount that goes in a spray tank using the correct concentration factor, shut off the upper or the bottom nozzles, put 100% of the spray in the top. But with fewer nozzles open, you have to recalculate the volume of spray per acre and then the correct concentration factor. Now, I want to end with just this little reminder that we're now at the stage of the first ethereal spray for return bloom on both Honeycrisp and Fuji. And I will repeat this little slide I've shown almost every presentation this year. We are now at the 16, 17, 18, 20, 21 millimeters. And so it would require you to put some ethereal in the tank, a relatively low dose, a half a pint to the acre. And it's an acre rate here, so you don't need to calculate any concentrations. However many acres you spray with one tank, that's how many half pints you put in it. And then that has to be followed 10 days later by a full dose of ethereal when the fruits are beyond 25 millimeters. And then 10 days later, another one, and 10 days later, another. And that'll take us basically to the end of June. So in summary, it's a good news in the sense that the heat gave us really good thinning on many, many blocks. And I'm predicting that even blocks that still look like they've got too many are going to drop more apples and will end up almost perfect because of the difference in size between the big fruits and the small fruits. There are relatively few blocks, I believe, that need additional thinning. And where they do, it's a bad news situation because there's just no weather to help you, and do the best you can, but I predict it will be modestly successful. If you had a problem with the heat and over thinning, that is really, really unfortunate. And maybe we can try harder to anticipate that heat in future years to give you that warning beforehand. So with that, Craig, I'd like to stop and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Terence. And thank you, Vaughn and Jim and Mario. Any questions? Folks can put it in the chat box, or you can certainly unmute yourselves and ask a question. Terence, would an Acid and Maxell spray help with return bloom on Honeycrisp by itself?
You should
Or
have
not
said
really?
that. Oh, absolutely. I should have said that. So one of our treatments in our return bloom experiments has been Exceed. And a full dose of Exceed is just the perfect first spray on return bloom. So if you're thinning with Exceed, you can forget my first spray of ethereal, because that you've done with the Exceed.
Than's
We've
question
tested
from
them. We've tested the successive sprays of Exceed, but they're not on the label yet. They work just as good as ethereal.
Okay.
And the reason I'm really interested in that is because of the darn Canadians removing the tolerance on ethereal, and then Mott's not wanting any ethereal treated fruit. So if we can't use ethereal, Exceed would be a perfect replacement to get return bloom on these hard to return bloom varieties without any ethereal. But it's not labeled beyond this 20 millimeter timing right now.
Thanks. Question from Warren: if you have a problem block like Fuji in the on year, would hedging now on a dry day work to take more fruit off? They've been pruned hard, but not hard enough. What other consequences might occur?
So the hedging is kind of you take fruit off, but you also take leaf area off. So it does help, but it does not overcome the inhibition of flower initiation. The only thing that really is going to help are these ethereal sprays on Fuji. I do want to comment, I got to somehow find a way to finesse this in what we tell growers. Pollyanna's work showed that Gala Honeycrisp has flower initiation quite early. Fuji, not so early. So with Fuji, it's not quite so critical to start at 16 millimeters, but you certainly have to start return bloom sprays by 25 millimeters on Fuji. And since you harvest it much later, like in October, you can put ethereal sprays all the way to the end of July on Fuji, whereas we don't really want ethereal sprays on Honeycrisp past the 1st of July. So those are two little nuances I got to figure out a way to make clear to growers.
Thank you. Other questions, folks?
Okay, just one other thing for Warren. Pruning, hedging this early always results in more return growth, vegetative growth, because the trees are still in what we call the grand phase of growth. However, by the 20th of June, they have pretty much on slowing down. Therefore, hedging on the longest day of the year works very well. Mid-July works very well. 1st of August works very well. But this early, it's not such a good idea. You get too much vegetative response.
For what it's worth, I looked up the newer data on the rain. We had a little bit of rain on Friday, and some folks had some rain yesterday, but it's not a lot. Between 1/3 of an inch and 1/2 an inch most places. It's raining a little bit now. So Mario was talking about soil moisture. Things were certainly dry after that heat of last week. And we're still a little on the dry side overall, I think, in most of our territory. Okay, I think we're going to end the meeting now. Again, thanks so much to Terence and Vaughn and Jim and Mario. We really appreciate everybody's participation. It's really great to have other eyes besides ours out there in the field. And look for this. We'll send an email blast as soon as the recording is ready. You can tell folks that have missed it today. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.